Now, one of my great interests in history has been the bonfire boy tradition in Sussex and the skeleton army riots of the 1880s, which is a subject all in its own. But all of those activities have their root in a traditional form of culture and of protest. Here we have a 19th century illustration of rough music, and there you see that they've got basic instruments. A man is actually being carried on the chair. Presumably he's the rough music leader, and he's leading them all in the noise and the outburst. This illustration is marvelous, actually, because this clearly gives you an idea of the sort of thing I'm talking about. This is from probably the 1890s, possibly the early 1900s, before the First World War. And you see the men here with milk churns, with sticks, making, and a bit of corrugated iron, making as much noise as they possibly could. So you would have gathered from the article that rough music was used against a man who ill-treated his wife. It was also used against parents who ill-treated their children, but it was also used against dishonest tradesmen. So, for instance, bakers putting a bit too much yeast in the bread, or brewers watering their beer, or butchers giving rough cuts of meat. So it regulated the community. Of course, the downside is there was no appeal. So if you were wrongly accused, there wasn't an awful lot you could do about it, and the police rarely intervened. Certainly in the early years, the police force in rural areas was so small, they'd be powerless to act anyway. Now, going back to the Lawrence Greyburn article of 1954, it produced a flurry of correspondence, of which I can only refer to a few. But the two I'm going to tell you about is that a woman, Lillian Brown, then living in Cookfield, but previously of Bury, also near Arundel, remembered that in that village, the rough music band was called a kangaroo band. And I wonder if that comes from the idea of kangaroo court. I don't know. But she remembered the entire ditty that the mob used to shout. And it may have had a tune, I don't know, but I can only read it. So the whole thing was, there is a man lives in this place. He beat his wife, a sad disgrace. He beat her black, he beat her blue. He made her poor bones rattle too. Now, if this man don't mend his manners, we'll have to send him to the tanners. And if the tanner don't tan him well, we'll nail him on a nail in hell. And if the nail should chance to crack, he'll fall upon the devil's back. And should the devil chance to run, we'll shoot him with this fiery gun. Now, talking about shooting, J.S. Chandler wrote from Hampshire about rough music against a butcher in the village and how the butcher responded and caused mayhem amongst the rough musicers. My father told me of a rough musician against a butcher in the village who was supposed to have ill-treated his wife. When the demonstration was at its height, the butcher filled his blunderbuss, i.e. his old-fashioned musket, he filled his blunderbuss with blood and fired it at the crowd. The blood was well spread, and the crowd quickly dispersed, thinking that some of their number had been shot. Right, now this unoffensive terrace of houses is in Wick, and Wick is the northern part of Littlehampton. Poor old Littlehampton still suffers from a bad reputation, and Wick has the worst reputation in the town, which I think is a shame because I like Wick. I've got good friends there, and it actually has still got, even now in 2020, quite a strong sense of community. Here's some of the more older cottages. Now again, in my research for the Greyburn book, I made it my business to try and find out as many examples of rough music as I could, and I found one from Wick, where about 40 men and youths with blackened faces had been rough musicking someone. The reason isn't given in the account, but a constable intervened, and as he tried to pull away a tray from one of the rough musicers, a man with a blackened face smashed the constable in the face with the full force of his fist. The blooded constable traipsed back to Littlehampton, came back with reinforcements, and arrests were made in a local pub. But because of disguises and blackened faces, they just blackened their face probably with soot, something, anything that would make it hard for them to be identified. One man was arrested, but at the trial, a number of local people came forward to say that he was innocent. And despite the police clearly saying he was guilty and they recognized him because he hadn't got a blackened face, the witnesses all denied it and said the man who'd done it, they knew he was, and he'd left the town and he wouldn't be coming back. And the case was dismissed. Now, we go from village to town. So if you can imagine how serious 40 or 50 people in a village might be, now imagine what it's like with 200 or 300 demonstrators in a town. This building you might recognize, and if you've ever been to Worthing, you will know the Crab Shack. It's a popular eatery. But back in 1850, that was a very prominent house, a house for a person with money and prestige. And in 1849, a Mr. and Mrs. Francis moved into the house. And Mrs. Louisa Francis was described in various accounts as young and fragrant and vivacious. And she started to hold fashionable resorts at her property, balls, soirees, that sort of thing, which in Worthing at that time was about all the entertainment the well-to-do had, and therefore if you were invited, that was really quite important. However, there was a much larger house in Worthing called Warwick House, long since demolished, where lived Mrs. Susan Tinling, and she had been holding these soirees and events for years. But rather than being young and vivacious and attractive, she was rather old and dour, and basically the fashionable set started to move from Warwick House to Greville Terrace, this house here. Now, where's all this going, you wonder? Well, it would appear that Mrs. Francis was having a number of liaisons with various men in the town, allegedly, and one of them, allegedly, was Mrs. Tinling's husband. So you can imagine how upsetting and horrible that must have been for the lady at Warwick House. Well, one spring morning, as they were all promenading along the seafront, and back in those days, the well-to-do always promenaded along the seafront to see and be seen, the two parties, Francis and Tinling, came face to face. And Mrs. Tinling could control her fury no longer and shouted at Mrs. Francis, "You infamous old Jezebel, if it wasn't for a Sunday, I'd do for you well," implying that she would strike her. Well, Mrs. Francis took out a court action of defamation against Mrs. Tinling. There was a court case in the town. The court was packed. The whole town was aroused. Remember, this is well before Facebook, television, tabloid press. People got their kicks and their indulgences from this sort of scandal and local gossip. So everyone was in the court. There were crowds of people outside. And in a humiliating scene, Mrs. Tinling was forced to apologize to her rival, Mrs. Francis, but she could not turn her face to look at her. The crowd, and it was more than a crowd, it was a mob, were all in sympathy with Mrs. Tinling and against Mrs. Francis, even though she'd won the case. And that night, as dark fell, a crowd of boys and men with darkened faces, carrying pots with stones in, began very slowly to shake them. So there was a very low sound of shaking pebbles in pots. And then as the minutes went on, the shaking got more and more vigorous, and the sound got louder and louder. And then they started to groan and to moan and to boo and to hiss. And then they started to throw stones at the window. And it was said, and you can see that that's quite a substantial building, that every window in that house was smashed by stones. And where were the police? Nowhere to be seen. The Worthing police force at that time was little more than 5 or 6 constables. They were hardly going to try and face off a mob of several hundred. And this protest continued for several nights until Mr. and Mrs. Marsham were forced out of the town. Sorry, not Marsham. Francis, Mr. and Mrs. Francis were forced out of the town permanently. They never returned. There was a case in 1869 of a newspaper proprietor who slandered fellow townsmen. He also received rough music. He then produced anonymous handbills alleging that one of his opponents in the town had deliberately burnt down his own shop for the insurance money, and another one of his opponents in the town was having a sexual liaison with a woman of the lower classes. This, of course, roused all the opinion. It particularly roused the family of this woman of lower class referred to, and he got rough music on a similar scale to what I've described. He tried to stick it out. He hired some heavies from London to protect him, but in the end, the violence against him was so great that he too left the town permanently. Now, I'm going to read you one more account from Worthing, and I'm going to read you from an account from the West Sussex Gazette. I quite enjoy the archaic style of writing of 19th century newspapers, so if you don't, bear with me. And this actually took place on November the 5th, 1859, and I did mention earlier that there is a clear connection between rough music, November the 5th, skeleton armies, and so on and so forth. They all form a coterie of community justice. And of course, November the 5th, the burning of Guy Fawkes, the burning of the Pope, took place across the country. But locally, unpopular local personages would be burnt in effigy. So actually, on November the 5th, 1859, a Roman Catholic clergyman was burnt in a 12-foot effigy. Also burned in effigy was the superintendent of police. And it was a rowdy evening. The rain was falling, but still the marchers rolled their burning tar barrels, dragged an old disused boat from the beach, set it on fire, and dragged this burning boat around the streets with the effigies on board. And by midnight, everyone thought that the revels had come to an end, but they had not. The mob, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, made their way to Bedford House. Now, if you go to Worthing today, there's a 1942 Southdown bus garage at the northern end of Bedford Row. But before 1942, there was this house, Bedford House. So this is the house in question, and living there were a Mr. and Mrs. Marsham, Mr. and Mrs. Marsham. They had many servants, as you might imagine, and they had a footman called John Puddle. And in October of that year, 1859, John Puddle was dismissed for being drunk and for stealing and for intimidating some of the female servants. That was the reason, anyway, that Mr. and Mrs. Marsham gave for dismissing him. A few weeks later, John Puddle drowned himself in the sea, and the local mob blamed the Marshams for his death. So that's the context to this West Sussex Gazette report from describing November the 5th, 1859 in Worthing. About 1 o'clock, a crowd of persons stormed Bedford House, the residence of Mr. J.C. Marsham, Esquire, yelling and hooting and making the most discordant noises. Before this time, several constables had gone off duty, it being thought their presence was no longer necessary for the public safety, and the strong wind bore the sounds of the riot away from where the police were principally stationed. The mob, therefore, encountered little opposition. They belaboured the doors with heavy sticks, rang the bells with much force, and broke nearly every window in the house. Large stones were found in the rooms, and Mrs. Marsham narrowly escaped being struck on the head by a brickbat thrown with much force through the window. Loud cries of "Who murdered the footman?" explain the cause of this terrifying midnight visit. The next morning, Sunday, Mr. and Mrs. Marsham left for London, but a mob of persons were in waiting at the station, the railway station, and hooted and yelled at them even there. The passengers in the train soon ascertained the circumstances, and at some of the stations further up the line, we were told there were uncomfortable sounds greeting the ears of the lady and her husband. And Mr. and Mrs. Marsham, just like Mr. and Mrs. Tinling, just like Owen Breeds, left the town never to return. So rough music was very powerful and very effective. But in those examples I've given you from Worthing, it's my belief that there were prominent people within the town encouraging the mob. People who, as I've suggested, had reasons to dislike these incomers into the town and wanted them out. So it's a sort of an unholy alliance between the working class and some of the elite in the town to keep the town just as they wanted it and to keep out the people they didn't want. Now I'm mindful of my time, so I'm going to come down and end. This is a larger picture of the one I showed earlier, and you see the rough music mob. This is a village. This is about 1900. And I'm going to play you an extract from an oral history interview. Oral history interviewing is one of the things I've done for many years, and particularly in the late 90s, I did an awful lot of interviews. And one man I interviewed was called Nobby Kinnard, Victor Nobby Kinnard, who was a marvellous character, an old Sussex woodman. And he was born before the First World War, and he was obviously very old when I interviewed him. And I'm going to play you him talking about the last rough music in his village. He says 1915. I think it was 1913. I think when he spoke to me on another occasion, he said 1913, which would make more sense because, of course, by 1915, many of the young men would have been in the army in the Great War. You may struggle, first of all, to hear him, but he does get louder, and you may struggle with his Sussex accent. The extract is about 2.5 minutes long, so it's not too long. There's also humour here. So we must remember, not only on occasion were people wrongly accused, sometimes we may wonder if people were accused just for the merriment of the people in the village. You know, someone had an argument in the pub, oh, let's give him rough music, let's pretend he was pushing his wife about. Because in this example, if you listen to Nobby, you hear that the wife comes out and isn't exactly pleased by the presence of the rough musicers. So I'm going to end with this extract. I think it's always good to end with history literally speaking for itself, and I hope you'll be able to hear it okay.
When they used to have the rough music.
Oh, yeah, well, that would be interesting.
You remember that, don't you?
You could tell us about that and when it was.
Well, that was in 1915. I think the last one I can remember was in 1915, the rough music, where my father was captain of this group, and what they used to do, because the police never interfered then, they used to go round to the house where the man or husband was knocking the wife about, and they used to give him rough music. They used to march up and down outside his house with a trumpet or whatever they could have to call him all the names, and etc., etc. And on this occasion, what I can remember, I can just remember it, but I didn't know really what it was all about. But my mum told me, because when you get someone going up and down outside here, where it only happened over there, when the old houses were there, and when Mum told me about it, I could see the funny side of it. But what happened was, in real life, what actually happened in my time was this chap over the road that lives there, his name was Mr. Short, and he'd upset his wife and knocked her about a bit, and they thought the best thing to do is give him some rough music, because the police didn't want to get intervened with this sort of thing. So my dad got his gang up together, and they used to go from here to Angwin at times and Patchin. And they decided what time to march up and down outside here, and Dad had one of them big trumpet with a big thing on, and it was very embarrassing. When they'd been out there about 10 minutes, old Mrs. Short come out and emptied her jury in his trumpet, you know. And anyway, that went on and on and on, and this chap, they have their faces black, you see, because you don't know who's who. And on this particular occasion, I'm telling you, my father was marching up and down talking to some of them. He knew their voices like you'd know mine. And he said to this chap, he said, what's the timing, boy? He said, oh, it's about something like 8:45. And Dad said, well, I expect we ought to give him about another 10 minutes. So this chap said to Dad, give him a quarter an hour and then we'll all disperse, you see. So anyway, Dad listened to him and gave him, because it's about 18 or 19 of these people, blokes, all the old woodmen they were. And the language is all that good then, you know, woodman's language. And he said to this chap, what's the time now then, boy? And he said, oh, he said, it's just on a quarter, Mr. Kinnard. Well, he said, we're packing now then, Dad said. And he said to him, well, now you can tell me who you are now. You've been up and down. And he said, I'm the bloke that's been knocking that woman about. Oh my giddy aunt. And he'd been calling all names and things all the evening, the old man. So that's what I can go back as far as that, when they had rough mood, what they call rough mood.
And that was the end of it, was it? The last time?
Well, that's the last time I can remember. But whether people does this sort of thing today, I don't know. I shouldn't think they would.
I don't think so. Not
no, because
like
the police used to close their eyes to it.
Yeah.
Right. Did that all work?
Thank you so much. I wish I could get everyone to spontaneously unmute, but we will save applause to the end. But thank you so much. Can we give Chris a jazz hands? Oh, it's awful, I know. Or clap your hands. A silent applause, Chris. No rough music. Quite the opposite.
No rough music. No silent music.
Very gentle. So I was trying to get the gist of the end of that story. Was it that the guy that they were meant to be inflicting the rough music on was part of the gang?
Yeah.
Right.
So
right.
he come and blacked his face. And of course, remember, this is before street lighting. So if you're in a little rural village, it's absolutely dark. So it would be very hard to know who was who. But that does give a bit more humour to it, you know, than the stuff that I was reading, which obviously is serious stuff.
Yeah, but So we still have public shaming nowadays, don't we? But most of it takes place on social media. Usually spats between people. But this was and it sounds like it. Well, what was it effective? Do you think? I mean, it's a very crude way of dealing with a very serious problem.
Well, of course, what we can't do is assess, one, whether any of these people were guilty. And two, of course, whether it changed their behaviour. All we've got are the accounts when either newspapers report what happened or it went to court. But I would imagine that if you're living in a small community, no one would want to feel the wrath of that.
Yeah. Someone's at Matt Barch, sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly, is asking, is this where the term rough justice comes from?
Yes, I think they probably are linked. It's I can't say for sure, but it would seem logical, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. And Lisa's asking, how widespread was it? Is this something that was unique to the South? Was it a national thing? Was it a
No. Thomas
thing?
Hardy mentions it in at least one of his short stories or novels. I can't remember which one, but it's definitely Thomas Hardy wrote about it. And in some parts of the country, it was called skimmington. Don't know the origin of why it was called skimmington, and other parts another name again, but it was always the same basic idea. Always at night time, always a group of disguised people, and always directed against. I think the important thing to stress is because this is directed against someone who cannot be dealt with by the law, either because what they did wasn't illegal, or if it was illegal, it was impossible to prove. And that's when the rough music would come in.
Good. Do we have any more questions for Chris? Let me just double check if I haven't missed anything. No. Where did you first come across it?
Well, when I was doing research on the history, when I was doing research on the Bonfire Boys and the Skeleton Army. So that was when I was at sixth form. So
Right.
that was 40 years ago, my God. And I started to understand and notice this ritualized behavior. But it was really doing the work on Lawrence Grayburn's book that I realized how widespread it was in villages.
And Skeleton Army, what is the Skeleton Army?
Right.
And the link.
They were people who opposed the Salvation Army. And in the 1880s and the early 1890s, there were violent oppositions to the Salvation Army around England, but particularly in the south and west of England. But I guess that's a catalyst talk all on its own, really.
We've also been asked the question, what's the link to the Bonfire Boys?
That ritualized behavior was carried on November the 5th, but to an extreme level. So you could get rough music during the year involving, 12, 13, 20 people, but on bonfire night, the entire population was out. So if you were chosen as a victim on bonfire night, that was a lot more frightening than the rest of the year. And at Horsham, they had a custom that the locals would meet in the pub at Horsham, I think it was the Green Dragon, and decide who was to be the Crispin. And that was because they made the decision on St. Crispin's Day, 25th of October. And when they decided who was going to be the victim, they made an effigy of them, and then they hung the effigy off the inn sign of the pub. And there it hung until November the 5th, when it was taken down and burnt, and a crowd assembled at the victim's house. So that's a public humiliation lasting, 10 or 11 days.
And is there any connection with a similar thing with Lewis Bonfire, except it's not local people? It's unpopular politicians and presidents, etc.
Yeah, so they've just carried it on, haven't they, to an international level. But even in the 19th century, Paul Kruger, the Boer leader, was burned in effigy. Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish leader, was burned in effigy. So even in the 19th century, there were figures outside of England who would have been burnt by the mob who disliked them for whatever reason. And the Tsar of Russia, he was very popular to burn.
Anna is asking what the local clergy's attitudes would have been towards this.
Well, it's quite interesting how the attitude of the clergy, and I suppose what we could call the middle class, altered during the course of the 19th century. So in the early to mid-19th century, the well-off tolerated this. I think they saw it as a safety valve. This wasn't continuous rowdy behavior. This was rowdy behavior on certain occasions for specific reasons. So they tolerated it. But by the end of the 19th century, when the railway was connected and lots of middle-class people were retiring to places like Worthing, they thought it was shocking. They just thought, what the hell's going on? This lawlessness. And so once they became councillors, once they became magistrates, they used the full force of the law to stop these demonstrations and protests, and people were arrested. And it gradually fizzled out. And then in some places like Lewis, it was reformed. You get the bonfire societies. So it's formalised rather than being reckless. But in Worthing, the last serious bonfire night trouble in Worthing was 1959, which is remarkable. So it took a long time for it to die out.
And final question, I think I don't know if it's a question. Andrew's mentioned that there used to be a local magazine called Rough Music that appeared in the early noughties. I'm guessing when he says local, I know he's based in London, but I'm guessing he's meaning local Sussex or Brighton or Worthing.
I don't remember that. No, there was a play called Rough Music, Rough Justice that was based on my history of Worthing that was put on in 1997, and there was a programme produced of that, which was called Rough Music, Rough Justice, but That's the only thing I can think of.
Right. And funnily enough, I've just had a little pamphlet with rough trade, which obviously rough trade was a very different thing. But actually, I was going to plug it. That's inappropriate to plug it at the end of your talk. What am I thinking?
I can't even plug my book because it's out of print. But people might get it on Amazon if they look, or wherever.
Well, you've got Chris. You've written. I don't know how many books you've written, but when you came and talked about Sussex folklore and smuggling, you had a queue almost to the door of people wanting to buy your books. You did something right. Your research is feels really thorough and full of passion. You bring real passion to your subject, and it's infectious. So yes, there are plenty of your books out there. I'm sure that people can find.
They can, yeah.
So thank you so much. And a few people have been saying, would you please come back and talk about some other things like the Skeleton Army and other aspects of local history. So we should. I think there's probably time to do another Wellesbourne Society on Zoom. So maybe we'll plan something in the autumn. That would be nice.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you again, Chris. And really nice to have you back. So I'm gonna pass over now. I'm going to mute Chris, and Sasha Bates is our second speaker tonight. And I've been looking forward to this talk for some time. We've been negotiating this for some time as well. Sasha is a psychotherapist and an author, and her talk this evening is called The Language of Loss. Thank you, Sasha.
Hello. So in November 2017, my husband died out of the blue, unexpectedly, overnight, at the age of 56. And up till that point, he'd been incredibly fit and healthy. And so I pretty much went into free fall. I didn't know which way was up. Although it was his life that had literally ended, it felt like mine did too. At the age of 49, part of me died with him. I'd lost my soulmate, my future, my sanity. It felt like at times I'd lost all certainty, all security. I felt like I lost my identity, and I didn't know if I would survive, and I didn't know if I wanted to survive. And I think that during COVID and lockdown, a lot of people may be feeling something similar, either because you have also lost somebody unexpectedly and out of the blue, or even if you haven't, possibly just because you're feeling completely all at sea because of the loss of certainty and stability and a future that we thought we had. And so what I want to talk about tonight really is about how grief felt, but also about how I did survive even when I thought I wouldn't, and I did become happy again. And if you'd have told me 2.5 years ago when Bill died that I would be happy again, not only would I have not believed you, but I would have also probably been pretty furious at the thought, because that felt like a betrayal. It felt like that was minimizing him and us. And so, yeah, I kind of want to talk about how I got from there to here, not because my grief ended, because I don't believe grief does ever end, but how I've learned to grow around it and live with it, and almost now enjoy having it as a companion. How I went from what felt like a bomb site to finding gems within the rubble of that bomb site. And I'm going to come back to that, the more positive finding of the gems, because I don't want it to be all doom and gloom from the beginning. So it does get slightly more hopeful. But to start with, I am just going to talk about the initial moments, the initial months, which did feel very much like my life was a bomb site. And that sense of sterile devastation may be something that those of you who have lost people to COVID might be feeling at the moment. And certainly the early months of lockdown reminded me of the early months of my grief, when I felt like the ground had gone out from beneath me, the rug had been pulled out. And some of you may recognize that feeling, and there might be others of you who have never really experienced grief and who therefore in a way fear it even more, because I think the general terror around grief when you haven't experienced it is that the options are either that you go into a sort of numb denial and you shut it all down, or that you completely collapse and are overwhelmed by the pain of it. And actually, those two polarities are the opposite ends of the spectrum, and there are an awful lot of other things that go on in between, which is not to say that you won't necessarily sometimes feel those ends of the spectrum, the numb denial or the overwhelmed collapse, because you probably will. And not only is it okay to swing between those two and everything in between, but it's also necessary if we're not to get stuck in one polarity or one way of grieving. But for me at the start, it did feel like a collapse, and not just emotionally, because I collapsed professionally. I was a psychotherapist. I am a psychotherapist, and I didn't really feel that that was something that I could return to. I felt that I couldn't really be there for my clients. I couldn't be the resilient, strong, safe, caring pair of hands that they needed me to be, because I couldn't be any of those things to myself. And also, being a psychotherapist, what my grief made me realize was how little I actually knew about grief. I'd been counseling people in grief for years, and I suddenly felt quite ashamed at how little I had understood of their experience. I've read all the theories and done all the studying, and actually it didn't bear that much resemblance to what it felt like in person. So I felt like I had let them down quite a lot up till that point. And it just made me realize how little the theories prepare you for the reality of what it feels like. They felt very inadequate. They didn't really bear much resemblance to what I was going through. And one of the things that I did from this state of collapse and freefall was I started writing. It was one of the few means I had available to me to try and somehow make sense of what felt like a senseless event. I'm sorry, it's going to just take me a sec to share the next slide. And obviously, I'm not the first person to think about getting my thoughts down on paper, or my feelings down on paper. They weren't even really thoughts. But I also knew it was necessary, as greater people than I have discovered in the past, that you do need to get your grief out somehow. But it's very hard when words feel very inadequate. I didn't really have any sense of what I was writing. It was nonsense. I knew I had to get it out, though. As a therapist, obviously, I know that it is better to get things out rather than keep them in. And slowly, like one of those old Polaroids where it starts off this sort of dark, blurry, completely messy image, slowly a picture of what my grief felt like started to emerge as the words came out of me. And with patience and over time, it was a very slow process. A clarity came to the picture of what grief felt like. And as I wrote, what started to happen over time was that I could see that my therapist voice started to come in and started to, in a way, help my grieving self. And it started to become a bit of a conversation. My grieving self was able to explain or somehow convey to my therapist self what the experience felt like. And my therapist self was able to bring a bit more of a clear-headed, rational thinking sense to explain and calm the terrified, grieving me. It didn't take away the pain, knowing what was going on and being able to understand what was going on. It didn't take the pain away, but what it did was it gave me some moments of respite. It allowed me to just occasionally move above it. get my head above the waves of the drowning and understand a little bit of what I was going through. And that conversation, that dual narrative between my grieving self and my therapist self, that became a book. Again, sorry, a little bit of a slow process. And I called my book Languages of Loss because I was really interested in how inadequate language had felt to me during the really awful early months of grief, how hard it was to convey in words, and how other languages beyond the verbal were actually more useful. The language of the body, I found that somatically I was really embodying my grief, and some of the things that my body was telling me were able to better convey what I was going through. And similarly, imagery, a sort of a more visual sense of conveying what I was going through. Before I was a therapist, I was a documentary filmmaker, and so I think the idea of seeing in pictures came quite naturally to me. So I discovered, by immersing myself in grief, not that I had much choice, it immersed itself in me rather than the other way around, by letting my grieving self and my therapist self and my filmmaker self all kind of get involved, it was like I was able to conceptualize grief in a different way, other than the way that we are all sort of taught to conceptualize it via the very famous, there's others, but the famous one is the 5 stages of anger, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I found those stages, or the idea of those stages, very limiting, very static. They were too neat. It just didn't in any way describe the enormity of what I was going through. And I didn't like the word stages. That felt too neat, too tied up, too linear. And so I had to find other ways of describing it. And again, with my sort of visual sense, I started to explain to people that it felt a bit more like shapes, like moving out of different shapes. And one of the things, one of the images that came up a lot for me was of grief being like, or feeling like a lava lamp. Whereas rather than stages, it was these sort of amorphous blobs that would constantly shape shift and sometimes get bigger and sometimes touch the glass and sometimes recede and sometimes join and sometimes be smaller and sometimes be bigger. And another metaphor that felt very strong was the notion of being in an ocean, being in a tsunami, in fact, drowning in it, being completely lost at sea, far from land, far from any kind of solidity, and very much at the mercy of something bigger than I was. And this notion of grief being lost in an ocean, that became the narrative thread of my book, because an ocean never stays still. An ocean is constantly unpredictable, is constantly on the move, and all you can do is somehow learn to go with it. You can't fight it, but you also can't be drowned by it. So I kept this oceanic visualization going, and it became the narrative thread, and it gave me my chapter headings, because it reflected the constant movement and the visceral sense of feeling ungrounded. And it enabled me to break free of those stages or tasks. There's another alongside the 5 stages model that everyone knows. A lot of people know the 4 tasks methods that William Worden described grief as. So my chapter headings, and I'm just going to go through them just because they give a sense of the different shapes and feelings of grief that I went through, just to, again, try and get away from this notion of stages. So the first chapter is the only one with a noun as a title, because it refers to that one-off cataclysmic event when Bill died and my life imploded. Now, obviously, it was a life-ending event for him, literally. It changed everything for me. Maybe some of you feel that that's what COVID has done to you. Maybe there was an implosion in your life because of it. But after that one-off event that kicked off the grieving process and the next stage of my unwelcome then life, every other chapter heading was a verb, because I felt it important to show that grief isn't static. So I called the next chapter Scattering, because that's what it felt like, that the safe ship that my life had been, the safe ship that was Bill and I, had exploded, and all the bits, all the fragments were scattered. Every bit of my life was just blown sky high, both my external world and my internal world. I felt my very sense of self fragmenting and felt very uncontained. And what that meant was that I was flailing for most of the time. This was my next chapter heading. For a long time, I was just flailing about, trying in a way to gather those fragments back into some semblance of a life. I was searching for some sort of containment. And at times I did get a bit of respite from it. And those moments I felt I was floating. I wasn't as fractured. I was just getting by, however. I was spent, but I was somehow staying afloat. And then I started to wonder, can I do more than just get by? Can I perhaps gather that detritus, that flotsam and jetsam of all the bits of my life, and can I sort of string them together and make a bit of a raft on which I can balance to rediscover at least some sense of stability, even if it is still aboard a very raging ocean. And I wanted to see whether I could perhaps then start to get upright from my very supine, collapsed position. And could I cobble together a bit of my identity back again? The next chapter I called Sailing. And this was really depicting how at times that very dodgy raft started to feel a bit more solid. It started to feel a bit more like a more stable sailing vessel. And it was definitely a vessel, a craft that was helmed by friends and family, who were the thing that really did keep me afloat. And life started to solidify again, and my internal world started to solidify a bit more, become a bit more stable, with the construction of this larger vessel. I started to get a bit more sense of groundedness, a bit more normality, albeit still on board a rather raging ocean. And of course, the ocean always has the potential to fling you back in it. If you're on board a ship, you might feel safe, but if a storm comes, you might have to lash yourself to the mast occasionally to avoid being flung back overboard. And sometimes you will get flung back overboard. And you start the process again of clambering your way back up. My final chapter I called Swimming, and this was because I wanted to acknowledge that sometimes you get back in the ocean, but that sometimes you're thrown back, but sometimes you choose to get back in. Sometimes you can choose to be in the water and not be drowned by it, but to be able to have some agency, be able to empower yourself to actually enjoy being in the water, to actually enjoy feeling feelings again that weren't going to drown you, that weren't going to take you under, but that could actually be joyful feelings, that could actually be pleasurable feelings. But it's still dangerous, of course, but you do have some sense of strength and being yourself again. And I thought long and hard about having this as my final chapter, because in many ways it would have been neater to have a final chapter called Landing or Grounding or Birthing. But I realized I couldn't do that, because I think with grief, you never do land again. And you're always, whether in the water or on the ship or back on the raft, you're always aware life never does feel stable again. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. And as I said at the beginning, there are some gems to be found from the rubble, and not being complacent and understanding the fragility of life. And the preciousness of life is one of the gems. Well, that's more than one. That's a few of the gems that I discovered. And the other thing that I discovered was that I didn't want my grief to end. That wasn't a negative thing. It became, has become, still is a companion to me that I like to keep close, because it reminds me of Bill. It reminds me of what we had and what I've lost. And I don't want that to go away. I don't want to be devastated by it in the way that I was in the early days, months, years. But I don't want it to go because I want him with me. So I don't see grief as purely negative at all. And the other thing that I found in having that discussion with myself about whether to end with the word landing or the chapter landing was how limiting language was. And I said that at the beginning. And you have to use, or I had to, as a writer, I had to use language in order to break away from language. So I did find myth and metaphor and imagery really were the things that helped me to find those other languages. And art and creativity in other ways. I mean, I'm not a musician, but music is obviously a language that for many people is very evocative. So is visual arts and artists. And I'm not sure I think I may have run out of time, but I found a lot of artists very helpful in letting them, in a way, convey how my grief felt back to me. And obviously for me, writing the book was my version of creativity, of turning that grief into something useful, because grief can be very transformative, both of you as a person and I think of what you make of life. And another image that I clung on to and use a lot, just gonna, sorry, go back to the screen sharing, is from a Japanese craft, I think it is an art form called Kintsukoroi. I don't know how to pronounce it. And what this is they take broken pottery, something that looks like it's smashed, as I felt my life was, and they not only piece it together, but they piece it together with gold paste. So all those wounds, all those cracks, all those destroyed bits are actually rendered more beautiful. And the new pot is based, it has the foundation of the old. You're not trying to get rid of the old you, or you're not trying to get rid of the person that you've lost, but you are taking them with you. You are creating a new golden threaded life that takes them alongside you and is based on that, but couldn't have existed without those broken bits. But there is a new work of art and a new thing of joy. So that's another image that I think is really helpful to me in understanding how grief can break you, but it can also make you. That sounds a bit trite. But I guess what I'm wanting to say is that it can be a springboard into something else. For me, it was a springboard into a new life as a writer, as opposed to being a therapist. I've also just finished my second book. That's a whole other story. And I'm about to start on the third. So having gone from feeling like I didn't know how I would survive, I can say that I am more than surviving. I feel I'm thriving and I'm joyful a lot of the time. And the gems that I found are many. I have found a greater aliveness. I understand the preciousness of life. I feel that Bill didn't get a chance to finish off his life, and so I have to do it for both of us. I have to really live the life that he would have wanted us to have together. I feel that I've lost the fear of death. Nothing scares me anymore. Once the worst has happened to you, you feel a lot stronger, a lot less fearful. I feel more, the other gems that I've got from all of this is a greater sense of compassion, both for others, for myself, greater sense of empathy, a greater sense of connection, a different pace to life. I've got a stronger faith in humanity. I have a stronger faith in spirituality. I'm more aware. I have better friendships. And I feel more loved. I definitely feel that Bill is still with me. I feel his love. I feel the love of my friends. But I suppose that's the message that I wanted to end with, that grief is obviously something that people are really scared of and really struggle with. And it is incredibly painful, and there's no way around that. But the pain if you go through it, you will come through it, and you will transform the pain into something that's quite precious, and that you, in the end, don't really want to be without. So that's kind of me, ending with this notion of gems in the rubble. Don't forget the rubble. You can't forget the rubble, but don't forget that there's gems to be found there. That's me.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you. Can we give Sasha a big round of applause, please? You'll only be able to hear me, though. Thank you so much, and thank you for opening up and sharing that story with us, and your thoughts and ideas around grief, because obviously none of us escape it. And as you said, there'll be people watching who maybe haven't gone through great loss yet in their lives, and I'm sure many watching also who have experienced incredible loss and pain and hardship, and can relate to what you were saying. Eleanor said that she really liked the Kintsukoroi. Am I saying it right? The metaphor.
I don't know.
You don't know either. So can I ask, how conscious was the decision not to go back to psychotherapy? I mean, apart from the fact that, as you said, you didn't feel able to at first, whilst dealing with the grief, but was it that the writing took over and you just wanted to move into that phase in your life, or other reasons?
Yeah, I just felt I wanted a break from it for a while. I thought once I'd written the book, I would go back to it, but then I got a second book commissioned and now a third. And so I feel like at the moment, I'm not, definitely wouldn't say never. I feel like at some point I will go back, but at the moment I'm enjoying doing something different. I did briefly go back. I used to work, I was in private practice, but I also, prior to being in private practice, I'd worked at a university as therapist to the students. And I did go back for a term because I felt like that was a way of sort of like putting my toe back in the water in a very contained, short term, only there for a term within an institution kind of a way. So I have gone back. I enjoyed being back in the chair, but I also enjoyed knowing that I was there for a limited amount of time. But yeah, I'm sure I will go back eventually, but probably not for a year or so. I miss it. I miss it a lot, but I also feel like I'm enjoying what I'm doing, and having a break will only kind of help when I do go back in the end.
Thank you. I've had a question here. You've had a question here. To what extent was your awareness of your body a help, guide, or hindrance in your journey through grief? I.e., was surrendering to how your body was responding helpful?
Yeah, it was helpful. It was it enabled me to understand that even when my brain had gone into overdrive, and I'm very much somebody who sort of goes into activity and busyness to distract from things. And so when my brain was kind of like leading the charge to, this will be fine, we can get through this, my body was always there giving me a gentle reminder that actually you can't just power on through. You do occasionally have to kind of rest and slow down, and you are feeling this more than you are letting yourself acknowledge. So it was incredibly helpful, but that's not to say that at times it wasn't very frustrating, because I couldn't move at my usual pace. I was constantly aching. I was constantly tired. I was wading through treacle most of the time. I felt it was another way in which I felt I'd lost myself. I was always very athletic. I actually was also a yoga teacher, and I was very used to doing a lot of activity, and to not be able to do that, it felt yet another thing that I'd lost. I put on loads of weight, my appetites changed. So I also hated it. But I was also aware that it was my body telling me that this isn't normal, that you're not going through a normal phase of your life, and you might not be the same person again, but you will adapt, and you will find a new way of having a relationship with your body and your activity levels, in the same way that I have to find a new way of being in relationship with myself and with others intellectually as well.
Anna has asked, do you think grief is something we should learn more about, for instance, at school? And could I add to that, if your answer is yes, how might we go about something as difficult as that?
The answer is yes. I think we are very slowly inching our way towards more conversations around it. I wonder if COVID and lockdown might be advancing that conversation a little bit. I mean, it's getting better than it was. There are things called death cafes where pre-lockdown, I don't know how they're probably Zooming now, but there used to be a few in different cities. I don't know if Brighton have one actually, where you could go and talk about death quite openly. There are podcasts. There's a really good podcast called Griefcast, where the comedian Carrie Adloyd interviews other comedians about their experience of loss, and they try and make it funny as well. I've written a book. There are other books around. I would buy them. I would, try and search it out. Yeah, I don't know whether taking the notion into schools. I mean, why not? Yeah, I don't know who would be the person to do that. But yeah, I think opening up the conversation, and anyone with any expertise in any field who wants to kind of talk more. There's a lot of people that work in the grief field who I'm sure would be delighted to expand. I mean, I guess doing things like this is, I've done a few talks around it. So I guess it's seeking out the sort of places where people are doing the talks or doing the podcasts or writing the books. And then if you have any ins with schools or other organizations where you can, spread the word, then try and match up the speakers and the institutions. I don't know, but I'm very up for being part of a conversation about it.
Great, thank you. Well, there's more questions coming in, but I'm conscious of time. And would you be happy to answer some of the questions via chat if you get chance to look through some of the other questions?
Absolutely. Do that.
But and thank you to everyone for sharing all those questions, and hopefully, Sasha, you'll be able to do that. So thank you again. And I believe that, I know there have been death cafes in Brighton. I don't know if they're still running, but I know over the last few years, certainly different individuals who've been running them and organising them, and even events in the Brighton Festival as well. I think there was a big death themed event that was put on 2 years ago by people who are involved as celebrants and as involved in death cafes. So thank you for suggesting that in the podcast as well, and of course your book. Lovely. So we need to move on to our final speaker, and I need to find her and unmute her. And she is currently in Zagreb. Liana, there you are. Okay. And whoops. And Liliana was introduced to me through Tim Crook, who runs the Bavard Bar in St Leonard's and Eastbourne, and said you must get her on the Catalyst Club. She's a brilliant speaker. So I don't know, Liliana, I'm sure you'll be able to tell us how you first got to meet Tim. And I know that you're talking. It's a new talk tonight, but I know you're Liliana is a biochemist based at Cambridge University, and she's going to be talking tonight about 20 years of experience as a scientist and what we can learn from science, and what she has learned from science. I believe that is the angle she's going to take. So Liliana, if you're there, then hello. I'm going to hand over, and very much looking forward to this.
Yes, hi everybody. And I'm now finishing this Catalyst Club after 2 wonderful talks. And I will talk about another journey. And this is my journey in science. And I think it's a particularly interesting time for science as well. And one positive thing that I agreed with all of my fellow scientists right now is how much the pandemic actually brought us together. I have never, in my 20-something years in being an active scientist, I have never seen so much collaboration, so much openness, so much data sharing as I've seen in these past months. But I wanted to tell you a little bit as well, what else did I learn, or what can we learn from science? Because I am also a huge fan of introducing new types of scientific education in the school as well. I think sometimes sciences are not taught in a kind of positive way. And we can still do a little bit more about this. And so I will share my talk. I will show you some of the molecules as well. So that's why I put the first slide. Just to warn you, I will not quiz you on any kind of structures, so no worries about that. And I need to apologize for any bad memories of your bad chemistry teachers, because this is one of the things that I get when I do maybe some popular chemistry talks, is I ask my audiences, do you like chemistry? Do you remember anything from chemistry? And when they say, oh, we totally, utterly dislike chemistry, it usually comes down to a bad chemistry teacher they had. So this is, I see David waving. Yeah. So, you know, this is what I realized in these 20 years of chemistry. We need to change the way we teach it, because, you know, it's absolutely everywhere. It's in the way we deal with the grief. There is lots of chemistry, there is lots of hormones, there is lots of molecules that are transforming as well in this process. When we create music, there are lots of molecular reactions that are happening as well. So chemistry is all around. So what I do, I studied chemistry. And so I kind of think of us chemists as molecular detectives. So we study all kinds of molecular structures which are made of elements, and we try to transform them. We first try to understand them, then understand the ways they interact with each other, and then put them in the new context. We want to see, can we use some of the interactions that we have discovered to maybe create something new or something useful? It might be a drug, it might be a particular product, it might be a solution. So currently there is a huge surge for drugs that might be effective antivirals. So this is also, now we're kind of going back to all of this knowledge about molecules that we know interact with viruses in order to find something that might be useful. And I work with biomolecules, which means these are molecules which are involved in some of the biological processes. So they are happening right now, all of these reactions in our body as well. And usually I struggled when I was a student, and I would go to the parties where people would invite me. And then I continuously felt as a little geek. You know, there were like conversations going on, but people would usually end up asking me about something like, what is the biggest molecule? What is the smelliest molecule? So in the meanwhile, at the parties, I could probably tell you this. So the smelliest molecule is this humble structure, which is made of carbons, and it has a sulfur. You know, for a chemist, this is very easy to basically make. And it's the smelliest thing you could imagine. So, you know, there's this wonderful quote from Derek Lowe, who's writing about the popular science. And he says, it makes innocence downwind pedestrians stagger, clutch their stomachs, and flee in terror. And you know, when you smell it, you have a feeling that there is some kind of super evil superpower in the place. And indeed, in Freiburg in Germany, when they made this in 19th century, a drop of this chemical was left on the lab coat of a chemist that made it. And he was already sensitized to it, so he didn't feel it as bad. And yet, when he got out of the factory where he was making, the smell could be felt hundreds of meters in the radius. It's so intense. So it's really nauseous. And one of the mysteries, and this is where molecular detectives come in, is why is it so smelly? Nobody knows why. What is the biological reason? Why do we react so vigorously to the smell of this compound? One of the theories is that is related to cadavers. So there are molecules which have sulfur in rotting flesh. And that's why, to prevent us from getting closer to them, we do have these very sensitive molecules in our noses that really react vigorously. to this kind of molecules. But what people also ask me in the parties is, what is the most explosive one? This is usually something that people want to know. What is the most explosive molecule? So this is another very humble structure. It's not very complicated. And this molecule was synthesized in I think 2016, so fairly recently, because we just didn't have labs equipped with the protective chambers where you could basically contain this molecule. And the legend says that you can make this molecule explode with the blink of an eye. So if you just look at it and blink, it will explode. And the reason for this is that a tiny pressure in the air waves that are reaching this molecule are they have a capability to just explode it. And the reason for this is, if you look at this structure, even if you're not a chemist, you see lots of N's, lots of nitrogens. So there's like such a vast amount of nitrogens in such a small structure. This is a very unstable structure, which will just tend to explode. So this makes for interesting conversational topics. And in the meanwhile, I felt geek at the beginning, but I embraced this. So I do get informed before I go to the party about the latest development in very exotic molecular structures. So I have embraced the Zoom as well. So I recently done some kitchen experiments as well, just to attract younger audiences to do some chemistry at home. And this was really fun. So I could make some kind of exploding substances in my kitchen as well, just using the ingredients. And I was planning to do this today, but I am actually in Zagreb visiting friends. And I don't think they were really delighted about having anything done in their kitchen besides cooking. So really, where is this wish to become a scientist? In my case, where did that come from? So I come from a very tiny village in the northern Croatia, not so far from Zagreb, 60 kilometers. And the current population, we call it a village, you would call it in England a hamlet, is 21 inhabitants. Plus me, then it's 22. And so it's a tiny place, but you're very much in touch with the nature around you. And there are not, because we are not so close to any big towns, we basically didn't have lots of toys when we were growing up. And so we found all of these toys around us. So actually from my class of 21 pupils, 15 of us went on to study biology and chemistry, just because we were kind of exposed to all of these wonderful things in our surroundings. And we were encouraged by our teachers to ask the questions about what is happening there. And in the villages in Croatia, you usually also have a little bit of land, you grow things. My parents have a little vineyard, so I was exposed to winemaking, which is a distillation, which is a chemistry process. So I could basically observe how this chemistry happens in practice. I also liked eating and cooking. So, you know, being in the kitchen from a small age really helped me to kind of understand that you can mix the things and you can create new tastes and new structures. And another inspiration for me were environmental issues. So I was kind of thinking, what can I do to preserve this nature? How can I deal with all of this rubbish that I have seen, or the news of pollution, or even a little bit of a climate change at that time when I was in the elementary school? And I realized with the help of my teachers that chemistry can give me some of the solutions. And this was one of the reasons for me to also go into the chemistry. So what have I learned by being in science? And this is just a fraction of the things that one learns. And the first thing is to observe. You learn how to observe, because you constantly need to look around. You need to look for the patterns. You need to look for some kind of tiny solutions that are going, or a tiny piece of puzzle that is going to help you to put the huge puzzle together. And one thing that you kind of need to continuously do is ask why. And for example, one famous biochemist asked himself, what is this white stuff in my Petri dish? Petri dishes are dishes where you actually grow bacteria when you want to study them, or some other microorganisms. And you see this little powdery thing on this Petri dish. This was actually a spore. It was the mold that contained a first antibiotic. So this is what actually happened. Antibiotic discovery by Ian Fleming was pure chance, because these spores were kind of floating around the lab when he had the window open, and they polluted his Petri dish where bacteria were growing. But he didn't throw it away. He didn't say, well, this didn't work. He said, why? What is this white stuff? I want to see what is happening. And here we have antibiotics. We didn't have something like this happening in my lab, but we have tiny little discoveries that come from us observing and asking the questions. And when we ask these questions, we also come to some surprising answers. And surprises are good. We like surprises in science, as long as they don't explode. And we also had those in the lab. We don't like those. But when you actually look for something and you surprisingly stumble upon something else, and you ask yourself, can I explain that? This is something that is really wonderful and actually applicable to life itself. You kind of learn to embrace the surprises. Surprises are good. They keep you on your toes, and they can give you some of the solutions. And one of the wonderful sentences that I always like to hear when students come to tell me that they have done something is, I ask them, did you see this coming? And if they say, no, I have not, then I think we are on the verge of something really interesting. So this is one of the lessons. And this is one story from a chemist, a German chemist, who did the same thing in 19th century. So he was working on this very unattractive substance, which is a coal tar. So it makes you, if you put it a little bit on your face, you will be totally dirty. But this is a source of very useful chemicals. And he was trying to extract these chemicals out of the tar. And when he was in the lab, he got some white powder on his hands, and he didn't clean it. He didn't see it on his hands. He went home and he cut a little bit of bread, and he started eating. And he realized that his bread is very sweet, So he asked his wife, what did you do with bread? Did you put some sugar in it? And she said, no. And he realized that this white substance he had on his hands was a saccharin. It was an artificial sweetener that we know today. And he extracted it by chance from this coal tar. So he got something he didn't expect. And fortunately, it wasn't toxic, which is good. Otherwise, that would not be a happy story. But he discovered something unexpectedly. And he asked himself, what is it? Why do I feel like this? I want to investigate that a little bit further. So there is this curiosity that is combined with all of these surprises as well. So saccharin was discovered by chance because somebody didn't wash his hands coming back from lab. I would not recommend that any longer. So no washing. So in our lab, we had a similar experience because we had a student working with a particular type of a DNA, which is a genetic carrier in our cells. And he was trying to make hybrid structures between this DNA and the gold nanoparticles in order to design a new stable material. And nothing has worked really for him. And then he just left his beaker in the lab for 3 weeks. And when he came, he saw that the solution became a little bit cloudy, reddish. And he said, okay, I'm not going to tell Liliana that I messed up my experiment, but at least I'm going to check what is the red thing. And he discovered this structure, which we called a kind of DNA nanoflower, which we later turned into controllable structures that we use now to design maybe a new generation of memory devices, a little silicon chips, which are designed of gold nanoparticles and DNA. And this is something that wouldn't happen if the student didn't at least want to see what is actually happening there. What is this? You know, a little bit of basic curiosity. And this brings me to another lesson, that usually in science, you really look for one thing, but you will most probably find another. And what I found very valuable for me is to train myself, or be trained by my mentors, to recognize the value of some things that you get, but you didn't expect them. And I think this is the most difficult thing. And if we look at the history of science, we will see so many events where people had a major discovery in their hands, but they just didn't realize they have it. So it takes a little combination of serendipity, but also a training to recognize the value of your discovery. And this is a story of Roy Plunkett, an American chemist, who was in 1940s working on and trying to find a new refrigerating compound. That means a compound he could put in different devices to cool them down, and also in refrigerators as well. And he was working on this, and on the bottom of one of his flasks, he found another compound, which he analyzed. And he realized that this compound is not really sticky. It's like whatever you put on kind of on the bottom of this flask, it just doesn't stick to it. Everything is just removed from this compound. And he realized, wow, this could really be super useful. And this is nothing else but Teflon, which was made in 40s. And this is one of the least stickiest compounds that you can use. And it's used for coating for many materials. And it has also changed the way we think about the space industry. So NASA has many parts of their shuttles and of your components also made of materials which are really non-sticky, simply because they are so robust and they can protect the equipment. And it wouldn't be without Roy Plunkett really realizing, hey, this could be actually a useful thing. Let me see what I can do this. So Isaac Asimov said that actually the most exciting phrase in science is not eureka, but it's that's funny. So this is one of the lessons that I would also say sometimes works in life as well. That's funny can lead to new relationships, new ideas, maybe a new trip, and maybe a new book. But in science, it often leads to new discoveries as well. So another story which I try to practice, and I also try to say to students, and I think we really need to keep this in mind in these trying times as well, is that when feeling stuck, take a vacation. And vacation can be just going away from all of these problems that you might have. And this is my personal story from my PhD, where I tried to kind of produce a special pigment that can make colorful DNAs, because you wanted to kind of check you wanted to kind of dye a genetic material so that you can see it under the microscope. And everybody was telling me this is going to be very easy. It's going to be a nice small part of my PhD, and then I can do bigger things. Well, 2 years into my PhD, I still didn't manage to do this very small little part of my PhD. So you can imagine that I felt very, very down. And I realized later that there is a phase in the scientist PhD, which is called a PhD blues, which usually strikes around the year 2. But at that time, I did not know that. So I decided to go to Croatia to take a little vacations and think about my life, and do I really want to continue with my PhD? And so I left all of the solutions that I had, that I synthesized, and I just, again, left them in the flask, thinking when I come back, I will clean everything and I will decide what am I going to do with my life. So it was that dramatic. And so I came back a month later. I decided to take a longer break. And then one of my colleagues told me, you know, those flasks that you left in a fume hood, there are some crystals in there, probably some impurities. He didn't even believe that I got something right. So everybody believed I made some impurities. And so I said, yeah, probably, but I should probably analyze them. So I reluctantly went to the head crystallographer, who was probably already annoyed with me by that time. And I told him, I got another set of crystals. They look nice. So could you please check when you have time? So he had time in like 2 weeks later. And you can imagine his excitement. And then you can imagine my excitement when he said, you got your die. And this was my attempt 35. So actually this die has the little name tag, and it has LF34, which means that it was 34th attempt to make it. So this is what actually helped me, is just to go away from the whole situation. I came back much more relaxed, but it also helps you sometimes to leave the things. Sometimes they need to mature. So just forcing them and going further is not going to be helpful. And this has this kind of little revelation, which seems probably obvious to many of you, has helped me many times in my scientific work. And it helped me to understand that we just need a little bit of patience in this all of these situations. Another thing, and then I will kind of start closing as well, is what I think it's very important to remember in these times. We have so many turmoils in our societies as well. One big thing that I kind of realized studying science, studying biochemistry, is we are all really made of the same stuff. What we are on the outside is a consequence of our biochemical cascades which are happening in our body. And these cascades, they are very much the same in all of the humans, and they are so similar to other living organisms as well. And they are all of these cascades and biochemical reactions and biomolecules within us are made of elements which have been created, you know, at a billions and billions of years in this part of the universe. And these elements, all of them, they are contained in the periodic system of the elements. And within us, out of this huge periodic table, we might have 20 elements which are really prominently featured, and some trace elements, and we are made of them. And so, you know, some combination of molecules you might really not like, and it's better to avoid those combinations, particularly if they have huge egos. Life is too short, but it's important to remember that even if you meet those combinations of molecules, just remember they are made of same stuff as you, and they have the same biochemical cascades as you have. So, you know, there is a little bit, I always feel when somebody drives me mad, I'm just thinking, oh, there is such a beautiful reaction happening right now in the nucleus of this human. So I should just focus on that. And this brings me to another, maybe one of the most important things is to play, to daydream, to imagine, to play even more. I think we are forgetting, after a certain age, we do forget to be playful and to enjoy exploring and daydreaming. And so when I was a teenager in the high school, I had a wonderful physics teacher, and he was talking about Chernobyl, because that was one of the hugest things and catastrophes that was really terrible and could lead to even more terrible consequences. An important thing about nuclear reactions is the presence of particles. So there are lots of kind of elemental particles that are kind of involved in nuclear reactions. And I started reading about this, and then I had an idea. There's probably a particle which needs to be discovered, and it's going to be called a frucon. And then I had an idea, okay, if I don't discover any kind of particle, I might discover a chemical element, which I'm going to call fruconium. So I went prepared to my studying of chemistry. And then I thought, if everything fails, I'm going to become a philosopher, and I'm going to start a movement which will be called fruconism. Nothing of this happens, but I have a theory that frucons might exist. They haven't been discovered yet, but theoretically, I have made a table of their properties. So their mass usually varies depending on the grade of deliciousness of calories which are intaken. Charge is anything but neutral. Composition and appearance, no idea, nobody has detected them yet. Symbol is already there, is going to be F. Antiparticle, every particle has antiparticle, is going to be antifrucon and causes vigorous combustion. Theory was postulated in 1990s. Lifetime seems to be stable, but it's slightly unpredictable. And just to tell you how these frucons could maybe look like when we have a device, how to detect them, probably is going to look like this. Frucons are very high when you lose your job and you just discover that there is a better job waiting for you just around the corner. They might be very high when you manage to get the habilitation in organic chemistry, although you failed organic chemistry exams several times during your studies. Friends calling you exactly when you thought of them. Frucon count very high. Realizing that there is only one ice cream left in the shop and this is exactly the flavor you like. Frucon count very high. Talking about frucons at Catalyst Club, super high count of frucons. So this is the quality of that particle. And one practical demonstration of a frucon happened last year in Rome when I was at a conference, and I decided at 11 o'clock in the evening just to take a stroll in the center of Rome and go to the Fontana di Trevi. And I was really randomly going through the little streets. I just wanted to have a stroll, and suddenly I hear the voice calling, Liliana, and I'm thinking, I'm not going to answer this. This is some Italian trying, to ask me something, and I'm not in the mood. And then I realized this person is actually running after me and calling me Liliana, Liliana. And I turn around and I realize this is an old friend of mine from Argentina who I haven't seen 20 years. And he decided to bring his family to Rome and have a stroll at the exactly same time. He did not know that I'm in Rome. I did not know that he's in Rome. And he just suddenly, they had dinner and he said, guys, let's have a stroll in Rome. And then they randomly crossed all of the streets and we just met in one of the small streets in Fontana di Trevi. Needless to say, we went for a drink and a chat. So I think in this event, the frucon count was extremely high. And you probably could name some of the high frucon counts events. The fact about frucons is we all have them. So this is what I've learned as well. This guy here, I was just reading about him, Hookons, Robert Hooke, who was extremely genius scientist that invented many things, including the microscope. But also some other people have them. So Brambellon could actually exist in high counts as well at a certain events. Bateson S, I decided to name this S as slim. Usually particles can also have kind of slim, heavy, different kinds of properties. So this would be nice. You can have Heron C, which actually sounds very much like a chemical element, but is actually a particle that can be found in a very high counts at a certain events when certain books are presented. So this is what are some of my discoveries about the science and the science of frucons and particles that we all have. And one important thing with what I would like to close as well, and I started with this, is really in all of this, we are all in it together. And, this is, for example, the lab my lab and the lab of my colleague, and we work on aging cells. So we try to understand how cells are aging, particularly if you have some kind of chemotherapies that you are using, then the cells tend to age faster. So we try to decipher the biochemical mechanism of that. And, you know, in our labs, we have many different scientists. We have engineers. We even have an artist that is helping us. Sometimes we keep her as an artist in residence because she asks silly questions, silly good questions. And this takes us a little bit further. But even if we take, you know, a bigger picture, we can't work alone. So even as a humanity, we really need to get together and get our act together to resolve some of the challenges that we work on. And in science, we know that there is hardly anybody that can succeed individually. We all work in teams, and we just need to learn how to work in teams. It's not always easy, but it usually works very well when there is a common goal. So I will stop here because I don't want to talk more. But I just wanted to tell you, high count of fruit cones currently. So thank you for making that possible.
Thank you, Liliana. Can we put our hands together, please, for Liliana? And I'll ask everyone to unmute at the end so we can give proper rounds of applause for all of our three guest speakers. Liliana, thank you so much. I love your passion for your subject. You too. Like I was saying about Chris and Sasha as well. There's an infectious nature to the way that you express yourself around biochemistry and science. And I have questions are probably coming in. I need to keep my eyes on the chat. I have a sort of a practical question for you. You talked about the student who was doing the exploration around nano flowers.
Yes.
What do you do if somebody discovers something that's actually, potentially life-changing and also, of course, potentially lucrative? How do you deal with the practicalities around patenting of something that might be discovered as a team, and then the inevitable or possibility of conflict around who thinks that it's their thing?
Absolutely. I mean, very controversial topic as well. They have been through the history of science so many people or students particularly, or PhD students, that were left out of a big discoveries because the big professor would be named on that. But today we have mechanisms. So usually if you work at a university, the university would be the one to file the IP. And in that case, you file the IP based also on some data which are written in the lab book. So if this data is written in the lab book of the student needs to be named as one of the inventors on the IP, which is kind of filed. Of course, this can be misused, and it depends very much on the mentor as well. But there are now, in the meanwhile, mechanisms that deal with this. So I would say much better now than 20, 30 years ago, when PhD students were not even named on some of the papers that would publish the thing. So yes,
great, thank you.
Was definitely named on that, which was good.
Anne said that she wished you'd been her chemistry teacher at school. I probably, as you mentioned at the beginning, many of us had those experiences with teachers at school who chemistry was one where I couldn't understand what was coming out of the chemistry teacher's mouth, and it was largely dictation when I was at school. So I was writing things down and hearing things and not even knowing how to spell them or being told how to spell them. Yeah. I don't know how I was pretty thick at that age, but I don't know how my classmates kind of understood what was going on, because I couldn't make head and tail of it, and I dropped it as soon as I could and understand nothing of chemistry as a consequence. And I'm sure I could have been turned on to the subject.
I'm actually sure that if I had worse teachers than I had, I would have chosen something else. But this was probably a changing moment, that I had a wonderful chemistry teacher already in elementary school that was able to put chemistry in context. I think science is so often taught really in a dry way. You have to kind of cover as many equations as you can. You have to memorize as many things as you can. But where is the context? And, you know, now we are realizing that science is everywhere. I mean, when we even take this COVID crisis, we were suddenly, I think people were suddenly overwhelmed with all of these scientific terms. What is the antibody? What is like immunological response? You know, how are the vaccines made? And so it is important. The technology and science are playing an increasing role in this very complex world where information is easily available. If we are not capable of discerning the good information from bad information, then we are in trouble. And, you know, schools can help us in getting these basics really understood, and then we can really make informative choices later as well.
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, I mean, you know, you even managed to confuse Donald Trump with the science, and he's got very high IQ, which we know because he keeps telling us. So yeah, it has felt like a particularly important time for science and for science facts and rigorous checks and understanding of things. A couple of people have commented on Roy Plunkett, the dark side of that story. I don't know about this. I don't know about the documentary. Have you got any comments on this for anyone who can't see it?
And Philip, wonderful that you mentioned that. Of course, this is not the only dark science story. There are many different stories where original discoveries were really kind of put into the relation with damaging health, with some other environmental issues as well. So this is what is also important to remember. The science actually doesn't really think in absolutes. So there is no absolute good and absolute bad. There is always a mix of the things. And what is very important is this ethics of science, which was often neglected. But we, for example, in Cambridge, we also teach it. So it's a compulsory subject. And in this ethics of science, we also explore the different steps that have taken some of the discoveries towards the dark side. And where are these checkpoints which we can introduce to actually minimize this kind of events? Another thing is, you probably all know, or some of you might know, thalidomide that caused lots of birth effects in 50s. Now, 40, 50 years after, we are using small doses of thalidomide to actually treat certain very aggressive types of cancers. So, you know, even some of the discoveries that we might had and we might have written them off might find some of the uses later. That said, there is no justification for some of the things. So there is no justification for having really terrible safety regulations, for not taking some safety precautions, as it happened in Bhopal in India in 80s, where, you know, chemical factories were built without even taking, you know, the human life into consideration and the environment. So I think it is very, very important to talk about the dark side of some of the discoveries. And we can go, you know, we can go through this in some other talks, but I think it's important to remember there are always these two sides as well. So no absolutes.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for Liliana before before we wrap up and we'll go to bed or stay up late, depending on your habits? Do you think, Liliana? I try and keep up with science a bit. It's difficult sometimes. The specialist language of science can be quite a barrier, can't it, to people? And I can't see how there's an easy way around that. Sometimes you get people like Bill Bryson who are able to, you know, as storytellers, able to articulate ideas from science in an accessible and fun way. And perhaps more rarely you get scientists who have got incredibly powerful, poetic, metaphorical language, like the guy, I've forgotten his name now, the Italian guy who writes about quantum not quantum mechanics. He wrote a book about time recently. He's written a couple of books, and they're very beautiful. I can't even remember the titles of them. Shamefully, I've read them. But it's but even in a book where he says, "I'm not going to give you any equations," there's still become those moments where I get confused because the concepts are such high concepts. Are there any? How do you deal with that? I know that's a hard question to answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think science, like anything, it's okay to have a little bit of challenge. So I encounter this continuously when I read publications as well. Sometimes I just don't get them, so I need to read several times. But I also agree that it's very important to encourage scientists to be more approachable. I mean, I used to work in Germany for a while, and in Germany, there is still a little bit of old-fashioned attitude to how the science should be communicated. This is changing, but not as fast in some other countries. So it is believed that for science, you need to use this high language, which is explaining the concepts as they are. You should not simplify them. I think the real magic is when there are people that manage to preserve the complexity, but just really explain it nicer. So what we always try to do with our students is to have at least some of the courses where they are really forced to explain a kind of concept, but really in 200 or 300 words, just to practice a little bit, because they will be faced with this maybe in the board meeting, maybe by a journalist. And so they need to be ready to kind of have some ideas of how to write.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Sasha, as well. It was Carlo Rivelli was the name of the scientist whose writing is just gorgeous. And what's Joe saying? If you can't simplify it, you don't understand it yourself. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a nice point.
That's a very good point. Yes.
Do you have any recommendations for blogs or podcasts?
Yes, actually I do. I was thinking, some of you might be aware of Radiolab, which is the National Public Radio podcast, which I really, really like because they have wonderful stories about science as well, and such a crazy topics. Why is blue not so common in nature, for example? So Radiolab is great. I'm a big fan, particularly now during COVID. I've been a huge fan of Ed Yong in The Atlantic. Maybe some of you know him. So he is an excellent writer who was recently, he wrote an article about immune system, which is extremely complex. And yet I think this is the best account of what the immune system is, written by non-immunologists and for public. So, some of these, I would start with that as well.
That's great, thank you. I subscribe to Nautilus magazine, and I get a weekly email with 3 articles attached to it, and I'm allowed to read 3 at a time. And if I want to read more, then I sort of pay for a subscription, or that it goes up. 3 is just enough. And New Scientist it just comes out. New Scientist is great, but it just comes out. There's too much, and it comes out too often for I've tried in the past to keep up with it, and it just piles up. The magazines pile up. Nautilus works for me because I can look at those 3 articles and think 1, maybe 2 might interest me, and they're not afraid of going into challenging areas. I mean, something like panpsychism has come up several times, which 20 years ago, I think any respectable scientific journal or blog would not have gone near it. But it feels like, things are changing in terms of the way that science perceives itself, its ideas, and its, as you say, its values and ethics, etc. More
Absolutely.
questioning.
Yeah, and I think there is, just to close, of course, science is mainly funded, at least academic science at the universities, funded by public money. And I think there is also an understanding that we have an obligation to inform the same public that is funding us about our discoveries in the way that the public can understand it and make use of it. So I think this is also a kind of shift that has been happening in the past years.
Great, thank you. Lisa Wolf's written Panpsychism ? I really don't think it's the right time and place for me to try and do a half-baked explanation of that. But you can Google it, Lisa. I think you'll find it in Wikipedia. I've clicked the thing that allows everyone to unmute themselves. So while you're doing that, I want to say thank you again a huge thank you to our 3 guest speakers tonight. So thank you, Chris, thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Liliana. Our next Catalyst Club is going to be on September the 10th. I'm not going to tell you who's speaking, but we've got some brilliant speakers, and 2 of those have spoken for us before, and I know that they'll be much appreciated, their return. And if you'd like to give a talk, or anyone you'd like to recommend for the Catalyst Club, then please do get them to get in touch. I've got some slots between now and Christmas. Particularly look out for some more female speakers as well to keep things nice and balanced, 50-50, which is how we'd like it to be. So I can hear everybody starting to pop up with their audio. So it just remains for me to say thank you again for participating, for speaking, for supporting, for being great audiences, and look forward to seeing many of you, I hope, on September the 10th. And can we put our hands together for our 3 guest speakers this evening?